We drove by this factory-looking building on the interstate, and my wife goes, "Hey, what is that? That's new." And it was called Ascend. And I go, "Wonder if that's a church. Go look it up." And so she Googles it. It's a marijuana dispensary, which is like the most.
That's the tough question.
Yeah, it's
non-denominational church or marijuana dispensary.
Is a religious revival happening in America right now?
Christian resurgence?
So the headline is that more young people are going to church, which is great news.
Dios, familia y patria.
Is political polarization making Americans more secular or more religious?
We're called to be biblical and we're called to be political.
You get aligned with other men that are like, hey, I actually have the same views as you. And it's like, it's okay to have that view.
More young women are abandoning religion than men.
Christ always, America first. That is what we stand for.
And just how weird is the American religious future likely to become?
If you're a Christian and don't have these apps, you're missing out big time.
My guest today is the perfect person to help answer all of these questions. Ryan Burge has direct experience with some of the decline in American Christianity. He's also, in my own opinion, the best data analyst tracking trends in American religion right now.
It's going to be a rough 15 minutes for those people who don't like graphs.
Ryan Burge, welcome to Interesting Times.
It's my absolute pleasure to be here.
So I want to start just by talking about the big recent religious trends in American life, and especially the claim that secularization might be going into reverse, or even that revival is in the air. But before we talk revival, I want to start by defining a very important term for understanding what's been happening in the U.S. for the last 20 years. And that term is nun. And I do not mean Catholic nuns, but something else. What is a nun?
Yeah, so nuns, N-O-N-E-S, are people who identify with no religious tradition. What that means is we ask a question about affiliation and they describe their religion as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. And that third piece is the one that we forget about a lot. These are people who look at all the options, Protestant, Catholic, Muslim, Mormon, and they kind of just shrug their shoulders and say, I'm not a Christian, but I'm not an atheist either. And they just click none of the above. So the nuns are those three groups together, atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular. And that group has grown from 5% of America in 1972 to about 30% of America today. It's the biggest social movement happening in America, or happened in America over the last 30 years, that we just don't talk about that much.
I don't know if I agree that we don't talk about it that much. I feel like commentary on religion, as long as I've been a pundit, has been dominated by the sense that America is getting less religious, people are disaffiliating. But then something changed, right, around 2020, 2021.
I think we're moving into a new era of what's happening with American religion. So it was rapid secularization from 1991 to 2020. Now we're in a period of stasis. Share of Americans who are non-religious has really stuck at that same level, around 30%. The share of Americans who are Christians is in the low 60s, maybe 63 or 65%. And it's been that way for the last 5 years now. This is a plateau, not a reversal. This is not a revival. The directions are not going, they're not reversing themselves. They're just staying where they are right now.
Give me some speculation, though, about why we've seen the plateau. Like, why do you think it seems like there is a sort of basically just a chronological pattern where for a while you could just count on each generation being substantially less religious than the previous generation. And with Gen Z and the millennials, they are less religious, but it's just not as strong a pattern as you've seen before. And I know this is outside the realm of data. I'm going to do this to you repeatedly in the interview, but did something change in 2017 to 2025 that would put a floor under religion, that would sort of make it seem a little more resilient?
Yeah, the way I think about it is, there's a bedrock of American religion that I don't think exists in any other Western country. What's happened over the last 30 years is a lot of people were loosely affiliated. They say they were Protestant or Catholic. They go to Mass once every 2 or 3 years. And they would say they're Catholic or Protestant because that's culturally acceptable. But as times have changed and the nuns have continued to rise, it used to be you didn't want to say you were an atheist. There's a lot of stigma against it. And now there's
God didn't like it
no,
too, right?
Exactly.
So, people were nervous.
And America didn't like it, because think about in the 50s and 60s, 70s, we had the Cold War. We were fighting against communism, which was atheistic, right? So there was sort of a stigma that we could not get over. And now over the last 30 years, that stigma went away. And more people, I think, were actually being honest when they took surveys and saying they were non-religious. But once you scoop off all that loose topsoil, those marginally attached people, you get closer and closer to bedrock. And I think what we've realized is there's a core of religiosity in America. I mean, I just don't see a future in America where the share of Americans who are non-religious rises above 50%. I mean, there's just nothing in the data that says that. When if you would ask me, 10 or 15 years ago, I would have said numbers keep going up, and that's not happening now.
How does the identification numbers interact with actual data on church attendance, which I know is itself, it's really hard to measure. People also will say they go to mass or church or synagogue more than they really do. But is it something where religious identification has fallen faster than church attendance? Or has attendance declined meaningfully in the last 20 years?
So we think about religion with three components: behavior, belief, and belonging. So behavior is like we talk church attendance. That's actually fallen the fastest of all of them. So the way we think about it is behavior is the first one that goes. And then usually it follows belonging. And then belief is sort of behind all those things. If you look at never attending people, they actually are more likely to say God exists without any doubts than they are to say God doesn't exist at all. So there's still this core of belief in America that you don't see that in the rest of the world.
Or you don't see it in Western Europe, right? I mean, when we're making these comparisons.
Exactly. Western Europe's our comparison.
India, Sub-Saharan Africa, you see plenty of religious belief.
Absolutely.
For historical context, I think there's a lot of people, maybe especially secular people, who sort of imagine that the story of religion in America is one where the country just sort of starts out super religious, maybe it's the Puritans, whoever else, and just has gradually become more secular over time. In fact, America has gotten more religious at various moments across its history. And so you have much more of kind of a cycle of revival, decline, right, rather than sort of just a long narrative of secularization.
I think in American religion, it is not a straight line. Like the idea that we're going to just slide towards secularization, the pendulum definitely swung towards secularization. I mean, the new atheist movement, 15, 20 years ago was all the rage. And now those guys are minor players in this conversation. I do feel like, we can't measure vibes. This is where we get in trouble with social scientists. But the vibes around religion have shifted from the new atheists are the coolest thing ever to those guys have tired ideas. And we should at least reconsider the role of religion, whether it be cultural Christianity seems to be on the march right now. Maybe not devout, attending Christianity, but the value of religion in a functioning society.
Right. And so in some of these vibes-based debates, you have been the guy with the data critiquing the vibe. That's one reason I wanted to talk to you, right? Yeah. That people will say, the country's turning back to Christianity. And you're there to say, sorry, it's a plateau, no big evidence of people going back to church. I want to talk about a few sort of subcategories, though, within that larger narrative where it seems to me like something genuinely novel is happening. So let's start by talking about men versus women. What is the historical pattern of gendered behavior around religion, and how is that changing, maybe?
In most countries where we can get data, women are more religious than men. Now, not dramatically so, but this is something we sort of know in social science, is that women are more religious than men.
Is this true across religions? Like, is this true in Islamic countries versus Christian countries, or is it mostly a Christian phenomenon?
It's mostly a Christian thing that women are more religious than men. What's funny is we don't know why. Like, there's all these interesting theories about biological theories. There's, anthropological theories. Like, women needed someone to help them take care of the kids, and church provided this kind of social safety net for them. We don't really know why. We just know that women are more religious than men. But what we're seeing, interestingly enough, among Gen Z is that women are still leaving the church at an incredibly rapid rate. and men are still leaving, but at a slower rate. And what that ends up being is the religiosity of Gen Z men and women is probably about the same now. It's not that men are returning to church. This is a really important point. The data does not say...
Well, some men are.
Some men are.
But in the aggregate,
we're not seeing Gen Z men become more religious. It's just they're secularizing slower than young women are, and that's allowing those lines to cross when it comes to religiosity.
Now, can you tell in the data whether this is what this means for specific churches, right? So, for instance, one of my colleagues just wrote a big story that I think you commented on about Eastern Orthodoxy in America, right? Which is a very small part of American religion, but there are a lot of stories, and I've heard them myself, about male converts to Eastern Orthodoxy being a big thing, right? So that would be a small example where you might say, okay, you have men sticking with Christianity or returning to it in particular places, but it's going to create a dynamic where some churches are much more male and some churches are much more female.
The Orthodox story is interesting, don't get me wrong, but we have to put them in context. Like, there's less than 1 million people going to Orthodox church in America. Of a country of 330 million people, Southern Baptists, there's 7 million Southern Baptists who go to church every Sunday. So like, let's put things in their proper orbit. My job is to sort of like not look at the outliers, it's to look at the middle of the distribution. And I think the reality is what's going to happen in the future is my church at the end, it was 75% women. And I think that's what a lot of these churches are dealing with right now because they're older and women tend to live longer than men do. I think that balance might sort of you get closer to evening out over time. But I still think the reality is that American religion, mainstream American religion, is still going to be majority female because boomer women are more religious than boomer men and Gen X and millennials. So this is a small trend that we would need to see continue for decades to actually see a difference you would feel on the ground if you went to an average church.
Do you think that balancing out is good for churches? It seems like you can tell a lot of different stories, right? But one story would be, okay, it's obviously good for churches to have more men in the pews, but if organized religion generally, Christianity in particular, has a specific problem losing young women, then you get a kind of, brotastic, would-be patriarchal culture in these churches, and maybe it accelerates a female exodus. Or alternatively, you say, look, no, actually, if you have a lot of churches that are suddenly 50-50 male-female, these are the only institutions in American life, maybe, that might have that kind of balance. You get more marriages, more successful communities. Which of those two stories sounds more realistic to you?
I mean, a 50-50 is a good outcome, but you've got to understand the types of Christianity that are still dominant in American life, which is evangelicalism and the Catholic Church, are both male-dominated across the board.
Male-dominated in their hierarchies and in their pastoral leadership, but not in who goes to Mass and church.
Exactly right. The pews, it's a lot more women. In the pulpits, it's almost all men.
Right.
That is not changing demonstrably, I think, over the next 20 or 30 years. But I will say it's probably not a bad thing if you're a young man or a young woman trying to find someone to marry and have kids and build a life with when there's 50-50 young men and young women in the pews. In that way, I think it's actually a very good thing. If you walked into a church and it was 90% Gen Z men and 10% Gen Z women, that's a real problem. I mean, 50-50 is a lot.
Well, for the men.
Well, yeah.
I mean,
but for the future of the church too, though, because then you become unattractive to young women because they walk in and go, whoa, dude, there's no place for me here. Churches need to be receptive to all kinds of people. And so that 50-50 future, I think, is actually probably a good thing if it holds. That's the most important thing. If these Gen Z men maintain this habit throughout the rest of their life, which, I mean, that's obviously an open question right now.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about class after gender.
Yeah.
Again, I think there's like the story that women are more likely to go to church or be religious than men. There's a long-standing story that's very popular among political pundits that says, okay, America is a nation with a secular elite and a very religious lower middle class or working class. Mm-hmm. The reality is more complicated, right? Talk about class and education in American religion.
In America, the data is really clear on this. Educated people are actually more likely to go to church than less educated people are. Educated people are more likely to identify with any religious tradition compared to uneducated people. Actually, the ideal combination of education and income for church attendance is people with a bachelor's degree making between $60,000 and $100,000 per year. So sort of like white collar, upper middle class-ish people. Those evangelical megachurches you drive by in the suburbs, called the Journey and the Bridge. Guess who's the modal member?
Elevate.
Yeah. Like we drove by this factory looking building on the interstate, and my wife goes, "Hey, what is that? That's new." And it was called Ascend. And I go, "I wonder if that's a church. Go look it up." And so she Googles it. It's a marijuana dispensary. Which is like the most...
That's the tough question.
Yeah,
non-denominational church or marijuana dispensary.
You can never figure it out. But guess what? The kind of people who would go to the non-denominational church are, like suburban, white, upper middle class, educated folks. That's what religion has become in America. It's the top end of the spectrum, not the bottom end of the spectrum. And I think the problem here is we get a lot of our theories from Europe. And in Europe, it's the opposite. The educated people are the least likely to go, and the less educated people are the more likely to go. So religion in America does not work at all like religion in Europe does.
That doesn't quite hold, though, right? When you go into graduate and sort of postgraduate degrees, right? It still is the case that the kind of would-be intelligentsia, right, is slightly more secular, and that religious practice is more common middle to upper middle class. So I'm going to give you anecdotes in response, right?
Yep.
One of the aspects of this kind of vibes-based conversation about revival in America is about people with PhDs, the intelligentsia, because in that zone, you just have a lot of stories right now. I go to college campuses and, people running the local Catholic parish or student group will say, we had X number of converts among the undergrads and grad students this year. And I did not hear those stories 10 or 15 years ago. Do you think that there's any scenario where the American elite is actually getting more religious in a concrete way?
I do think that there's a future in which their religiosity does increase, but I'm not sure that we can pin it on just like their belief in the Bible or God is what's driving that. Religion is obviously a theological pursuit. Absolutely.
Right.
It's also a social pursuit, though. Like, people realize that going to church does all kinds of good things for them outside of just saving their soul from eternal damnation, right? It allows them to make friends. It allows them to find a partner. It also allows them to, I need a veterinarian. I need a dentist. Oh, hey, Dr. So-and-so sits in the pew 2 behind you. Just go talk to him. It creates this social connection. I think educated people, they don't realize this. Like, they don't vocalize this, and it never clicks in their head of why they're doing these things. But what we see over and over again is that dropping out begets dropping out. So dropping out of religion, like the Nothing in Particular group we're talking about, they're the very lowest level of educational attainment. Only 25% of them have 4-year college degrees. So they're dropping out of education, they're dropping out of religion, and they're dropping out of politics. So they're basically isolating themselves from American society. And I think education, social trust, institutional trust are all sort of locked together in this matrix of things that make you either more willing to engage in polite society or less willing to engage in polite society. Educated people have a level of trust that less educated people do not.
I mean, this connects to what you were saying. For a lot of people, it seems like disaffiliating from religion is just a way of sort of being disconnected from institutions. And then as religion either remains resilient or becomes more potent in the upper middle class, it becomes sort of, in a way, pardon my language, a sign of like having your shit together, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Like, that's what I always tell people, if you want to know who goes to church, it's educated people who have middle-class incomes, are married with children. That is the golden path we talk about.
Right.
Like what leads you to success in life leads you to church.
This is a very sort of economistic, secular-ish frame for understanding religion. So my last question about possible sources of revivalism, let's make it a little weirder, right? It seems like let's talk about sort of non-Christian and post-Christian spiritualities, because it definitely seems like whatever is going on with the vibes, some of it has people newly interested in astrology, the paranormal, witchcraft, UFOs. I tell this story a lot, but I go into my local Barnes & Noble, and it used to be that there was, one shelf that you would call like paganism or witchcraft or something. And now it's like 4 or 5 shelves of tarot cards and magic and all of these things. Now I, live in New England, haunted by witchcraft for hundreds of years, but still something there has shifted. What do you make of sort of non-Christian or post-Christian religion or spirituality as sort of a source of cultural significance for religious belief?
So this is something that I got asked about a lot. Like, people are replacing religion with these new spiritual practices. And so we did a survey of 12,000 non-religious people, and we asked them, how important is spirituality to you? From not at all important to very important. We gave them a list of practices like tarot, yoga, astrology, meditation, all these things. 25% of them, of the non-religious people, said spirituality is very important. It was 60% of religious people. So the more religious you are, the more spiritual you are. And this idea there's this huge number of Americans who are spiritual but not religious, we call them SB&Rs, is really not there in the data. So this idea they're replacing it is actually false. They're not replacing religion with spirituality. They're replacing religion with nothing, is what it looks like.
So does that mean that those shelves in my Barnes & Noble reflect mostly syncretism? Like, it's just more people who are sort of defining themselves officially as Protestant or Catholic, maybe going to church, but they're also suddenly interested in tarot cards and astrology?
Two things I would say to that. One, yes. I think there's a lot of people who are like buffet Catholics, right? Who are like, I'll take this piece from here, and they go to mysticism for this. And so I think that's part of it. The other part of it is, I think that the people who are really committed and buy a lot of literature. You don't have to have too many people in that core to make that market actually work.
Right.
I think that's actually probably what's happening here is a small group of very committed people and listen, a lot of that kind of leans toward the female side, like a lot of Wiccans are females. And guess who the number one buyer of books are? It's women.
So there is potentially a kind of potent version of American paganism. It's just numerically pretty small.
It's very small and it's very loud. So they're sort of overrepresented on places like social media. So in our minds, we make it a lot bigger. The share of Americans who are not Christian and are not nun is probably 7% of the country right now. The share of Americans who are Latter-day Saint in this country is 1%. I mean, we take these small religious groups and sort of blow them up in our minds and act like they're much bigger because Christianity is the norm. We're just used to what that is. Even today, 60% of Americans are Christians. Like, for every one Muslim in America, there's 60 Christians. Like, we've got to be clear about how the size of these groups. Not saying that Muslims don't matter or Latter-day Saints don't matter. It's just important to know in the relative context of macro religion in America, they're a rounding error compared to Christianity.
Let's talk about that big number, because the big story of the last 2 generations is one of decline. Mm-hmm. Some big parts of American religion have declined to a point where it's hard to imagine them coming back in a big way. And the biggest of them all is the Protestant mainline, which is the set of denominations, Methodist, Baptist, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, we're basically the dominant religious force in American life for a very long time. And my own theory, and it's obviously not mine alone, is that the decline of the mainline is itself an underrated part of our present polarization and derangement, that we used to have this set of sort of centering religious institutions that don't exist to the same degree and on the same scale anymore. And this is something that you've experienced directly. You were a mainline Protestant pastor at the First Baptist Church of Mount Vernon, Illinois.
Correct.
Just talk for a minute about that experience and what happened to that church.
Yeah, so I took over that church I was 24 years old.
So you had gone to seminary?
No. God bless the Baptists.
No.
We need no training.
No training. Good.
I started as youth pastor for 3 years as a part-time job, and then I became a pastor because, listen, in rural America, there's a supply and demand problem when it comes to pastors. And I was willing to raise my hand and say, I'll go do it. So I joined First Baptist in 2006. They had about 50 people on an average Sunday. And this is a congregation. This is a 14,000 square foot building on 7.5 acres of ground. When they built the building in the 1960s, there were 300 people on an average Sunday. It was one of the pillars of the community. Like, all the teachers and the lawyers and the doctors were part of this church, and it was a shell of itself when I got there at 50 people.
This is Northern Baptist.
American Baptist.
American Baptist,
yeah.
but it's not the Southern Baptist Convention.
That's right. We are the mainline flavor of Baptist faith.
Yep.
And so some churches were LGBTQ affirming, some churches had female pastors, but it was up to the local church to decide that. So every church was a little bit different on their theology. In Southern Baptist, you can't have female pastors. You can't do gay weddings. So my church, kind of slid into, obscurity over time. When you walk in and you see a whole bunch of gray hair and no kids, that's bad. I was there for 17 years. In the last year, we would have 10 or 12 on a good Sunday. We actually had to give our building away to a private Christian school because we couldn't afford to pay the insurance and the upkeep and the maintenance and all those things. And then eventually we decided this is sort of a not good use of our time and resources. So, right after Easter, we voted to close, and we were going to close as close to our anniversary as possible. The church was founded in 1868, and it closed in 2024. And at the end, we had about 28 people on the membership roll and maybe 10 or 12 actual attenders on a regular Sunday.
Why?
Because I'm a bad pastor.
Well, I mean,
Ross.
I didn't want to.
You don't want to say the obvious, right? I'm the worst pastor in the history of the world. So I tell people I've been a part of 3 churches and 2 of them don't exist anymore. So if you want your church to close down, hire me and give it like 5 years and it'll be done. But listen, because if you look at macro level religion, guess what? Christianity in America has been in decline. Well, it was in decline for 30 years. The main line, which is what my church was, has been in absolute free fall for the last 70 years. There's some data from the 1950s that say over half of Americans were on the membership rolls of a mainline church in 1958. Today, it's 8.5% of Americans are mainline Protestant. And in a lot of these traditions, the average age is about 60 years old, which is certainly not good for the future of a church. But I was also in a community that's the same size today as it was in 1950. So we're not growing.
Right.
Christianity's not growing. It's like we had all these things working against us, and there are tens of thousands of churches in those exact same positions right now. They're just like sort of holding on for dear life as they slide toward closure like my church did.
So why did this hit the main line in particular so hard? Why such a decline so fast for this, big and pretty diverse group of churches, right? There are big differences between Episcopalians, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and American Baptists, and yet all of them have experienced this kind of decline.
Yeah. So there's an article written by J.P. Demarath in 1995 in a scientific journal where he basically makes the argument the mainline declined because it succeeded so well. It got the average American to accept their worldview of religious pluralism and individual freedom and free speech. And it used to be the mainline stood apart from the average American as being different. And then when the average American adopted all these mainline principles, there was no differentiating factor between the mainline and the average American. And that's why evangelicalism's done so well, by the way, because it's clearly stood apart from the rest of the culture and says, there's us and there's them. We are not them and they are not us. Let's have these distinctive beliefs on gay marriage, on female pastors. And some people are drawn to that difference. A guy told me once, he goes, listen, I went to a mainline church for a long time, but it felt like a country club with Jesus. I'd rather just go to the country club, because the mainline's always been sort of squishy on these things. The Southern Baptists are 80% Republicans at this point. White Southern Baptists are 80% Republicans. I think in some ways by them not choosing a side in the political, fight that we're in right now, people want to go to a place that's coded left or right. And the mainline resisted all that. And I think that's actually part of their demise is because people couldn't figure out what they are.
So often you'll hear a narrative that says churches decline because they become too politicized. And I've made versions of that argument myself. I've said, and I've argued that you could see it applying to both left and right. It seems to me, though, like you're saying that in certain ways, political tribalization can be a source of strength, right? I mean, so which is it? Does polarization bad for Christianity, or are churches succeeding by leaning into it?
I think it could be good for the church, but bad for the country. Let me make this point clear. Most pastors are not, even evangelical pastors, are not standing up at the pulpit on Sunday and saying, the Trump administration is great. We support their immigration policy. This is a misconception that people who do not grow up in religion have about religion. Is I always say, evangelicals are don't go to that many political meetings. And the first comment's yeah, they do every Sunday. And I'm like, no, you haven't been to an evangelical church. They're not being overtly political. Now, they might talk about their view on marriage or their view on gender or something like that, but it's not inherently political like that. where the politics comes from in a lot of these churches is the bottom up. It's coming from the pews. It's coming from the Bible study. It's coming from the parking lots and the hallways when people, that's what happened in my church. I never talked about politics from the pulpit, but people before and after church, I'd hear them talk all the time about politics. And it was, it was Republican politics, to be quite honest with you, because I'm in a Republican area. That's what's happening in a lot of these churches. What's happened in America, especially white Christianity, is coded as Republican. And that's not always been the case, by the way. I think this is a point that people forget is even in the 1980s, among the white evangelical church, the share who are Republicans and the share of Democrats was the same.
Yep.
Same in the mainline church. So what we're seeing here is really a unique moment. The number one predictor of whether you're going to be religious or not in America, besides obviously the religion questions, is what is your political ideology? If you're a liberal, 50-50 chance you're a non-religious person. If you're a conservative, it's about a 12% chance that you're a non-religious person. I think people are being attracted to church because they see it in America, especially white people, as being a conservative institution. And we're even seeing the rise of people say they're evangelical who don't go to church because they like what the word evangelical means. And so what religion's become is another tribal marker of who you vote for on election day as opposed to, what it used to be.
Why does politicization and polarization seem to help conservative churches more than liberal churches?
I think young people think that, I'm a liberal, so I'm going to be irreligious. They don't even accept the possibility that you can be a liberal Christian anymore. And I think this is the problem with the mainline is they thought the solution to the right-wing movement of the evangelical movement is to become super left-wing. I think a lot of Americans are actually searching for a church that's relatively apolitical in the pulpit and the pews. So here's what I tell people. I go, if you are fine with your church having a rainbow flag out front, but you're not happy with another pastor having a MAGA hat in the pulpit, there's a problem here.
The Catholic Church, for various reasons, has sort of, I think, worked harder to try to present itself as above politics. You have, clearly strong white Catholic support for Republicans, but, the church is going to issue criticisms of Trump's immigration policy and so on. But is there a strategy, apart from leaning into tribalism, that you would actually recommend to pastors and leaders?
I think this is the hard thing, is how do you be aggressively apolitical? Yeah. I think there's ways to do it. And I think actually the Catholic Church is a great example of how they could lean more into the consistent ethic of life. I tell my students about this, by the way. For those listening, it's the idea that life should be protected at beginning, middle, and end. So from natural conception to natural death. Catholic Church is opposed to abortion, opposed to birth control, but also opposed to the death penalty. It's also opposed to unjust wars and physician-assisted suicide. I explain that to my students, and they go, yeah, I don't really know if I agree with it, but I respect that position. It helps me think about these issues of life and death in a way that I've not thought about them before. Helping people sort of think holistically about these things, but not being super directed. This is where the Trump administration violates the consistent ethic of life is a better way to go about it. Let them make the connections, not you make the connection.
Yeah, but that's a hard balance to strike,
100%.
Right? And I feel like you often get, it's just as easy to get a dynamic where your consistent ethic ends up alienating people all over the spectrum, right? It's look, the Catholic bishops take a lot of flack from political conservatives for policies that, that are seen as liberal or left-wing, especially around immigration, but also around the environment. But at the same time, they win no friends on the progressive left by being against euthanasia and abortion, and, whatever exciting biotechnological evils await in the future, right? So that, it just seems like you can end up, again, just talking sort of in terms of practical pastoral strategy in a polarized environment, you can end up in kind of a sour spot, right? Even when you're trying to be as holistic as possible in your message.
Yeah, but God calls us to be faithful, not successful, right? I understand, I'm a demographer. I talk about the growth and decline of these religious groups, but at the end of the day, isn't part of what we're supposed to do help people think about the major problems that the world is facing, society's facing, they're personally facing? So if you're at that little church that's declining in the Midwest, what's your option at this point? You're not going to start a praise band and bring new people in. Might as well preach the gospel as best you understand it and sort of let the chips fall. And that's a fatalist position, by the way. I totally understand that, but what's your alternative?
No, I don't think it's certainly not a fatalist position if you believe in God. But that preaching the gospel question, what about issues of belief, right? So one of the narratives around mainline decline has been, yes, it's somewhat about politics, and yes, it's somewhat about class and so on, but the mainline also seemed, relative to more conservative and evangelical churches, at least in its leadership, to just not be as sure about core doctrines of Christianity. The resurrection, the miracles, the literal stuff, right? And that even if you look at the evangelical churches and say, oh, they're too partisan or they're too ideological, you go to those churches and they are talking about Christ crucified and raised from the dead and the forgiveness of sins and these kinds of things. Yeah. Do you think that is also a part of the story of which churches grow and which decline?
The data says that, mainline clergy are definitely much more squishy on these theological issues than evangelical clergy are. But I think this is like one of those like haunting questions that I have is, a lot of people are doubters. They can never certainly believe any doctrine of their church. Like the pastor stands up and says something very stridently and confidently, and the people in the pews go, yeah, I hope so, or I guess so, or maybe that's true. Right. I just think it's more prevalent in the main line than it is in the evangelical church. And let's be honest, Ross, in the Catholic Church, it's widespread. The people in the pews are not there because they agree with the church's teaching on a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, a majority of Catholics are in favor of abortion. Almost all Catholics have used birth control. A majority of Catholics are in favor of female priests, and yet they show up because it's more than the belief thing. It's something else going on there.
Yeah, I guess I would this isn't my personal belief structure, but I feel like someone could stay in the pews for a long time disagreeing with the Catholic Church about whether abortion should be fully banned, if they still believed that, the Mass was what it claimed to be and that Jesus rose from the dead.
Yeah.
Do you think that's right, or do you think it's all sort of just a continuum of political beliefs, supernatural beliefs, and so on?
I do think that the people who show up generally do have a supernatural belief in God. They do believe in the core. But I think we can all admit that throughout our lives that our core beliefs have sort of been malleable, and we believe more and we believe less.
Absolutely.
And what keeps us in the pew then, right? If our belief begins to wane in the literal resurrection of Jesus Christ, what keeps us going? I think it's that social aspect of like, we expect you to be there. We would like you to be there. You're a valuable member of our community if you're there.
Right.
And
you're raising kids.
Exactly.
You've got to take them to church, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Like I think it's you need both and, right? Like I don't think there's a huge number of people who go to church every Sunday who literally believe in none of it, right? I think a lot of people show up and go, I hope I believe, or some days I believe.
Lord, help my unbelief.
Exactly right. Like on my best day, I do believe these things.
I guess I'm just sort of interested in finding what is the unexpected lever that changes religion in some way in America, right? And so, if you had a bunch of liberal Protestant pastors who were still political liberals, but who suddenly were less squishy on the core religious questions, I'm just interested in what does that change? And maybe the answer is not that much, that it's always just a numbers game.
I just think there's a certain number of people who are drawn to certainty.
Yep.
And there are certain people who are repelled from certainty. And what does church look like for that second group? Those doubtful people versus those certain people. The main line's always been the refuge of the doubters, right? Who try their best to believe these things, but just can't get over the hump sometimes. And if that goes away, if you're Protestant, your only option is the evangelical pastor who pounds the pulpit and says, if you don't believe what we believe, you're going to hell. And the person sitting there goes, yeah, but how do you know that? So I think that's what we're missing is this huge chunk of people who were open to the idea of belief are not going to have an outlet to go to a place where they really do feel like people like them are welcome and the conversation's worthwhile, because it's going to be, unless you believe what we believe, you are less than us. And I think people, why would you want to go to a place where you feel like you're less than voluntarily? I mean, I certainly wouldn't.
And so then just to go big picture for America, what is, for the non-religious person who's like, why do I care about the Protestant mainline? What is the takeaway of mainline decline?
I mean, there's something called social contact theory. Gordon Allport talked about it. It's just the idea that like being around people who are different than you makes you more tolerant of those differences. And when we're so cloistered, right, where it's just all these people who believe all these core beliefs about Jesus and gay people and women pastors, you don't know the other side. You never hear the other side of the argument actually articulated in a thoughtful, loving, careful way. You just see the memes on Facebook about the other side. And atheists are in the same boat. They don't understand evangelicals at all. And they basically create the worst version of them in their minds where they all hate gay people and they all hate women and they're all super conservative. They hate immigrants. And it's like, no, the average evangelical is not really there either. So I think what we do is we create caricatures in our mind because we never interface with someone from the other side of the aisle. And it's hard to hate people when you know them, when you see them every day. And unfortunately, because we're becoming so cloistered, the main line used to be the great meeting place.
Right.
Left, right, and center all hung out together. And now all we've got is really conservative religion and no religion at all. And there's really no meeting place between the two.
All right, let's use that as a segue into larger questions about the future.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the religious America of 2050, right? What parts of American Christianity are growing right now?
Yeah. So the rise of the nuns is the number one story.
Right, that's number one. But among people who are religiously affiliated, it's non-denominational Christianity.
Yeah, to me, that's the second biggest story is the rise of the nuns, non-denominationals. They were, in the General Social Survey, about 3% of Americans said they were non-denominational in 1972, and today it's 15% are non-denominational. Denominationalism is in the decline really across the board. The only large Protestant denomination that's growing consistently is the Assemblies of God, which is sort of a Pentecostal evangelical denomination. And they're doing really well, actually. But every other denomination, whether it be, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Baptists, Lutherans, they're all significantly smaller today than they were 20 or 30 years ago. So what the future of American Christianity is going to Protestant Christianity is going to look like is very little denominationalism and a whole bunch of non-denominationalism, which from an analytical standpoint is incredibly hard to sort of wrap your head around. Right?
Yeah, but I'm gonna ask you to generalize. We were joking earlier about the kind of cliched names of non-denominational churches for people who aren't familiar with that world, right? What is non-denominational Protestantism right now?
Generally, they're evangelical. I think not all of them, but the vast majority are evangelical in their orientation and theology and just practice and all the things that we would call evangelical. I think the one thing is they're anti-institutional. They're anti-authority in a lot of ways. It's like, where does your money go when you put it in the plate? Well, it goes right here. It stays right here in these four walls. So what we're going to have is a very sort of fragmented Protestant Christianity that's, you got a little fiefdom here of 15,000 people in this church and 20,000 people in this church. So I think the problem is it's going to be harder to conceptualize, to measure, to really understand what these groups look like, because now you've got these little like pockets. Like you got Joel Osteen, right, in Houston, Texas. He's an evangelical, but he doesn't interface with most other evangelicals. You got Paula White down in Florida, who Trump loves, but she's Pentecostal and believes in the gifts of the Spirit. So Franklin Graham would never talk to Paula White. So, you've got all these little pockets that they don't like sort of add up to a cohesive, what is evangelicalism? Right. In 30 years, that question is going to be almost impossible to answer. Not that it's easy now, but it's going to be 10 times harder because of this amorphous nature of non-denominationalism.
Does that depoliticize things? We were talking about, evangelical identity as a kind of tribal political identity. But if you're totally fragmented and everyone is sort of loyal to a particular pastor in a particular setting, do you think that non-denominational Christianity is less Republican than the evangelicalism of today or 10 years ago?
I think evangelicalism has been so branded, though, as Republican, it's kind of hard to like shake that larger mentality. But what you do see is you sort of start seeing the cracks are forming. And like, for instance, a lot of those churches are male-led, and their official doctrine is that, only men can be pastors. But like on Mother's Day, they'll have the pastor's wife get on stage with the pastor and talk about like what it's like to be a mother. And so they're trying to like sort of like half step away from conservative evangelical orthodoxy. They won't make plain their views on same-sex marriage, but if you ask them like in private, they'll tell you, we don't do gay weddings. So they're not going to be as strident because they want to grow. And so a lot of them are sort of, what the sermons they give are like 3 ways to be a better father, 2 ways to be a better, Christian or church member or whatever. It's sort of Christianity light, but I mean, listen, at the end of the day, the proof's in the pudding, right? They're the only ones that have shown growth in this era of secularization. So what they're doing has to work at some level.
Does this just make American Christianity more supernaturalist in some way? You mentioned that a lot of these churches are Pentecostalist.
Mm-hmm.
Pentecostalism, for those who don't know, is, you mentioned the gifts of the Spirit. It's very focused on speaking in tongues, prophecy, healing. Very different from the mood of old school mainline Christianity, right? So that's already changed. Does it change more? Would you expect religion as practiced in 2050 generally to be more supernaturalist?
I think that what is the common thread that runs through religious growth, not just in America, but across the world, is Pentecostalism, what we call charismatic worship, which is what a lot of people see when they think of non-denominationals, is the drums, the guitars, the raised hands, the long worship sets. And so this emotionalism, I think, is actually a predominant factor. And this is where the mainline loses, by the way, because I don't know if you've been to a mainline church. There's no emotional.
I was raised Episcopalian in Southern Connecticut.
Yeah.
So I have some familiarity with mainline customs.
Yeah, no raising of hands in those churches, huh?
No raising of hands, but also just, the idea that Christianity is a supernaturalist religion, which is woven into Catholicism in its own way, saints and healings and so on, was altogether absent, right?
Yes.
And I think you can tell a story where 1950s American Christianity, in some ways a peak of Christian practice, is also sort of the least supernaturalist style of Christianity, right?
The most intellectualized.
Very intellectualized, very, very sort of suburban American way, modern 20th century progress and so on. And the equivalent, even if it is also suburban today, is much more like, we baptized someone and, he was blind and he got his sight back. Like, this is a video I was literally watching this morning because someone linked to it, right? From a mega church, right? So that's just a bigger part of Christianity now and going forward.
This is in the 1960s, if you went to a church where people raised their hands and rolled in the aisles or had these big emotional responses, people would look at you like you're an odd person. And now millions of people are engaging in that worship. It's been very normalized, I think, in modern America. And I think the downside of this is it leads to a Christianity that's really all heart and no head. I think the problem with the mainline has always been it's too much head and too little heart. You got to have both in equal measure. And I don't know, there's no tradition, by the way, I think it does a good job of sort of targeting maybe the Catholic Church, Ross, to play a little home.
Well, that's our goal, right? That's the Catholic goal. But I think the pattern with Catholicism has been, weirdly or not weirdly, Catholicism is now getting lots of not just intellectual converts, but sort of would-be elites who in the old days would have become Episcopalian or Presbyterian, now become, if they want to be religious, they're more likely to become Catholic, even as Catholicism, which was once like the big mass immigrant working class religion, it's losing ground in that territory. So there's an odd religious dynamic of like Catholic elites and evangelical non-denominational churches that are underrepresented in elite society.
But I mean, look at the Trump administration. Like J.D. Vance obviously converted to Catholicism famously, but Marco Rubio has always sort of walked halfway between.
He's been in both worlds.
Exactly right. But I think that's a very strategically smart thing to do, not just nationally, but especially in Florida. Because guess what? If you go to a non-denominational church and a Catholic church, you've checked off religion in Florida for almost everyone. So I do think that these elites they're strategic in this.
You're so cynical about our political leaders, Ryan. What about race, ethnicity, and immigration? You get a lot of movement from Hispanic Catholicism into Pentecostalism. How much of these changes are demographic changes?
So one way that non-denoms have actually done well is by creating diverse congregations because they're in diverse areas. You know, if you're suburban Houston, for goodness sakes, it's diverse. But I think, the Catholic Church in America would not be what it would be without immigration, especially from Central and South America. The question, though, that we have is how do they assimilate to American culture? For instance, if you come here from the southern border, you land in a county that's overwhelmingly Catholic, you'll stay Catholic. But let's say you move to a place like suburban Dallas where, the elite class are all going to elevation and the journey. Are you going to start moving in that direction because you want to sort of assimilate and be seen as part of polite society and not segregating in your own Hispanic community? That's an open question that we don't really know the answer to, because it's happening right now all across America, especially second generation too. So, you weren't raised in the Catholic Church in Mexico, so you don't have the strongest connection as your parents do. Your parents want you to go to Mass, but man, all your friends are going to that cool church down the road. What do you decide to do, right? So that's a huge part of it. But the other part of the immigration story that's really interesting is, like, if you look at like Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, those are immigrant religions. Like that's how they got a foothold in America. Are they going, if they can't rely on immigrants because of the current situation that we're in right now, how do they maintain or grow their size in the United States when their fertility is starting to look like American fertility, which is very low? So that's a different story than bringing new people in from overseas.
Is there any non-Christian religion that you would expect to be more influential in 2050 than it is today? Or to at least something like the role that Judaism eventually took on in 20th century America?
I think Islam is going to have some influence in some pockets of America, but most certainly not, in a macro level nationwide way. We talk about Michigan, obviously, in Dearborn. That's a majority Muslim community now. It's the first large one in America. But even there, you've got to get to sort of a critical mass, and it doesn't look like a lot of these religious groups are ever going to get there. So I think the reality is where they're geographically located really kind of puts a ceiling on their ability to influence the national political conversation.
The Amish, I have to ask, because you're talking about numbers and fertility, right? And I have read fun demographic projections that say, guess what, by 2075, 15% of Indiana and Pennsylvania will be Amish. Is the 21st century the Amish century?
In some odd way, I actually think they might have. But here's the thing: Amish people typically stay out of politics. That's been their posture for a long, long time. Now you do
for now.
But
if you have a situation where a substantial portion of southern Pennsylvania is actually Amish, I think it's more likely to happen in Midwestern states. But do you put any stock in those kind of demographic predictions?
I think at the local and county level, I think there's a real possibility that Amish could start winning elections and changing policy, and maybe even win a state rep, something like that. But
just forget politics.
Yes.
Would you bet on exponential Amish growth?
I would bet on continued Amish growth, but not exponential Amish growth, because as a religious tradition gets bigger, it's harder to maintain its cohesion like it had before. When you're 100,000 people, like everyone stays in the tribe because it's like everyone.
Yep.
But once you get to several million, I think this is what the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is facing right now. Is it almost is a victim of its own success because it got so large in America that it's easier to leave now because you don't feel that sense of internal cohesion. There's not been a single religious group in American history that's got incredibly large that's maintained its growth rate all the way through. So they will continue to grow probably faster than other forms of religion, but I just don't see a future where in 2100, if the average Amish family is 6 kids and they all stick in that tradition, I would be shocked by that because it would buck everything that we know about how religion works in America.
All right, I want to end by pushing you towards wilder speculations.
Oh my gosh!
And you can resist, right? But we're trying to stay with the data here, and you are a partial debunker of overly enthusiastic projections of revival or anything else.
Yeah.
But religious change in U.S. history, to say nothing of the world, is often pretty weird.
It is.
And in the early 1800s, Thomas Jefferson had this famous quote where he said, there's not a young man today alive who won't die a Unitarian.
Yes.
And Unitarianism was it was the rational faith of the future.
It was.
In 1800. And then instead we got tent revivals, great awakenings, everything else. Just give me some thoughts about the weirder things that you see as a student of American religion, and some kind of speculation about just the weirdest thing you're keeping an eye on as a future trend.
I wouldn't say it's the weirdest thing, but I think it's the rise of the tradcath, I think, is really interesting. For those of you who are listening at home, tradcaths are people who reject Vatican II. The idea that we should do the Mass in English is ridiculous. We should do the Mass in Latin. Women should cover their heads. The priest should face the elements when he blesses the elements. Like, we should go back to the way it was 100 years ago, because that's when the Catholic Church was strong in America. There's actually an argument to be made that might actually be the future of Catholicism in America, because those families don't practice birth control. And they have lots and lots of kids.
But for traditionalist Catholicism, in whatever form, to really take over U.S. Catholicism, you would, like everything else, you would need conversions. You can't do it with
fertility,
large 7-kid families alone, at least over a 25-year time horizon.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
You're speculating about a lot of people who are right now not in that world joining that world.
I think you could see a lot of like right-wing regular Catholics would go and shift over because they like the politics of what that church means and how the church is going. Now, listen, I don't think like in 50 years, a majority of American Catholics are going to be enjoying the Latin Mass, but I do think it might be a significant minority and a vocal minority too, which in some ways is actually more important than actual butts and seats. The other thing I'll say, and I think this is really, really interesting, is the main line is starting to take some cues from evangelicalism and really focusing on church planting, which is starting new churches. So like the Episcopalians, for instance, if they find an interesting young priest who seems, like really engaged, they'll give him a whole bunch of money and say, go start a church somewhere. Here's $1 million or $500,000. And if you need more money, come back. Because guess what? We've got a lot of money. We don't have a lot of, exciting young priests. And so maybe, church planting has basically been exclusively the purview of evangelicalism the last 30 years. And we're seeing some of this on a small scale. Episcopalians might be coming back because they're starting fresh. They're not moving into an old building with all this tradition. They're saying, no, let's lean into like the journey and the ramp and the village, but just in an Episcopal way. Like, listen, what's the alternative for the mainline right now? It's perpetual decline. So you might as well go out swinging. And I think some of them have picked up on that message and actually might be aggressive in church planting in the future. And there might be a future for the mainline.
Out of the mainline denominations, who's going to make it? Would you bet on the Episcopalians because they've hit bottom? Like, I think this is an interesting thing. Places hitting bottom and actually benefiting from hitting bottom sooner. Who do you bet on?
I think the Episcopalians, because of their institutional heft and their, financial support, to be honest with you, are going to last for a very long time. I think the United Methodists are going to continue to persist because there's just still a ton of United
Methodists. There's a lot of Methodists.
Yeah, there's like 4.5 million even today after the schism. And I think getting over the schism is going to sort of like, okay, we've gotten over the worst of it now. We can sort of survive with what we have. I do wonder if there's going to be some sort of mergers or at least friendly cooperation between the Lutherans and the Presbyterians. We call them the Seven Sisters in the mainline right now. In 50 years, there's certainly not going to be Seven Sisters.
Who else would you bet on? Which out of the small groups in America, from Eastern Orthodoxy to non-Christian religions, who do you think is big in 2050? Surprisingly big.
Yeah, so there's these little bitty denominations that are actually doing really well and grow, like the Anglican Church North America, which is sort of the more conservative wing of the Episcopal Church. They're only 125,000 people, but they've had sustained growth now for the last 15 years. They're a very new denomination, by the way, which I think actually works in their favor because it's like they're combining the best versions of evangelicalism with the best versions of the mainline, which I think is really successful. There's a group called the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, which is Tim Keller, who is a very famous preacher, was a most prominent member of the PCA. They've grown consistently now for 30 years, and I think they're going to continue to go up. But, I think like the Orthodox Church is probably going to, do relatively well. But by relatively well, I mean like they might add 25% membership in the next 30 years. We're not talking, we're never going to see a mega denomination like the Southern Baptist Convention or the United Methodist Church ever again.
Ever again?
Ever again. Because,
all right. Well, you'll have to come back to this show
when I'm on my last
2050. Talk to my AI avatar. And on that that can be the last question.
Yeah.
New religions.
Yeah.
We haven't really talked about the role of the internet. I think it's sort of the ground underlying a lot of the trends you're talking about. But when you look at everything from online life in general to how people relate to AI and so on, do you see something genuinely new emerging in that space, or is it all too soon to tell?
I see the role of the internet actually being somewhat destructive to American religion in that it shows you all the bad things in a very compelling way. Like, why do they not believe this? Or why are they inconsistent on this thing? Or did you know the church's history on this is bad? What's really interesting is so we had the COVID thing. We're going to move church online, and over 90% of church were streaming online right after COVID. And what we've realized is that online church does not do any of the positive things that we thought in-person church. And I think, like we did, we're going to work from home. And guess what? Now everyone's back to working in the office 3 or 4 days a week. Like nothing that we've seen created online seems like it has any legs to it. Even among young people who attend online and in person, 2/3 of them prefer attending in person and 15% prefer online. And the other 15% don't care either way. Like, so even young people are not drawn to digital anything. Listen, religion's endured for all of Western civilization because it works for lots and lots of people. And no matter how much we try to remake it with technology and AI and the internet, showing up on an average Sunday with a bunch of people and singing some songs and saying some creeds and hearing a sermon is transformative and will be for all of human history as far as I can tell.
All right. That's a bold prediction and a good place to end. Ryan Burge, thank you so much for joining me.
It's been a pleasure.